Hello, my name is Billy Korando. I'm a developer advocate with IBM, and today in this presentation, we're going to be looking at Tekton for Java developers. So Tekton and how we as Java developers would try to be working with it, what would be relevant to us. So if you find this presentation interesting and helpful, definitely check out this series I kind of put together on IBM on developer.ibm.com called Living on the Cloud. The most recent article in the series, which should be published by the time this article or you're watching this presentation, covers a lot of what I'm going to be covering in this presentation. It's actually a very long article because there is a lot of detail, there is a lot of complexity to Tekton, which we'll be kind of covering here in a few minutes. But this can be helpful to kind of get really into a lot of that detail to really understand what is going on. So what is Tekton? Well, Tekton is an open source project, and it's a CI/CD definition framework. So continuous integration, continuous delivery, continuous deployment definition framework. And it's built off of the Kubernetes API, and as a consequence, it can actually then also run on Kubernetes clusters. And it's currently in beta for the core project, though there are also other sub-projects that are in alpha, but we'll get to that a little bit later, and I'll note which kind of projects are in alpha versus which are in beta. However, the beta stuff should be pretty stable, so at least the tasks or the Tekton resources that I will be showing that are in beta, a lot of that should translate well when it goes GA. Alpha, there could be more of a risk of some things changing, but again, it should be relatively stable. So again, what is Tekton like? Why should you be interested? Well, Tekton has a lot of the same advantages and some of the same risk or some of the same issues with Kubernetes. So first, it offers incredible extendability. So the Kubernetes API itself is extremely extendable. Tekton, building on top of the Kubernetes API, shares a lot of that extendability. You can kind of change and update the Tekton API to kind of fit in a lot of the different needs of your business domain as needed. Also, because it's running on Kubernetes, that it's really all fundamentally the units of work that are actually happening are actually running in containers. Well, that offers a lot of freedom and flexibility to do whatever it is you kind of want to need to have done. You're not really limited to any kind of specific way of how Tekton wants to do something when at least it comes to actually building or testing or anything kind of like that within your project pipelines. Tekton is also extremely reusable, which again kind of comes with some both benefits and some drawbacks. So the benefits of reusability are, well, obvious, that you can kind of build some tasks, build some pipelines, build these kind of different resources, and if you design them right, well, you can easily reuse them in other projects. But the downside to that is it does create a lot of layers of abstraction, which can make that initial learning curve quite steep. I kind of ran into really almost like kind of the cliff and had to really climb up it to really kind of understand what's going on with Tekton. And hopefully this presentation will make it a little bit easier for you and for other people to kind of grasp on Tekton. But it definitely is there. And again, we'll kind of get into that a little bit later on. And flexibility, kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, but because everything is running in a container, or at least a lot of the units of work are running in containers, that gives you a lot of opportunity to kind of do whatever you need to have done. You don't have to follow maybe very specific ways of Tekton or other CI/CD frameworks, how they want you to maybe do some sort of task. Whatever container you have, you can kind of have run within that. So a lot of great flexibility, but then all this flexibility, extendability, reusability does come with some costs of increased layers of abstraction, and just a bit of fundamentally just a more difficult learning curve. So it's kind of a bit of a weighing the options here on this. But there are some benefits, and probably once you are as an organization kind of get through that initial phase of Tekton, I could see it being a very powerful, very, very useful way of approaching continuous integration and continuous delivery because it's building off of Kubernetes, and if your organization is already doing Kubernetes, you're able to kind of translate a lot of those skills from running Kubernetes clusters to also running your CI/CD framework. So if you're not familiar with continuous integration, continuous delivery, maybe kind of heard about it, just need a little bit of a refresher. Let's just quickly go through that. So in continuous integration, continuous delivery, let's just have a quick overview where it starts really with a git push. Of course, it could be any kind of some sort of software source control management, and kind of push event or something like that or equivalent, but anymore it seems pretty much like everyone's on Git. So your developers or whoever, they push code to the shared repository, and at this point it kicks off some sort of trigger, some sort of event that says, hey, something's changed in here, now let's build it. You're going to build the code, on some sort of service, and then you're going to validate that code. Now, I use the term validate to be more broad and encompassing of all the stuff you kind of want to do to make sure the code you're building is correct. So, of course, the biggest thing, this is going to be doing automated tests to make sure that it's all meeting business requirements, there's no bugs, and so on. But this could also include code quality checks, and also generating documentation, and also probably really importantly, doing some sort of like security scanning to make sure underlying dependencies aren't having any sort of issues or any known exploits that need to be fixed before you push to production. So that's going to be all kind of encompassed, at least in here, at least stuff that can be done without a deployed application. So from your continuous integration, hopefully you didn't automatically deploy it in continuous delivery fashion to a non-prod environment. So it could be stage, it could be int, it could be development, it could be kind of whatever environment, just non-production, where you may then be doing some more testing, end-to-end testing that you need to actually have a deployed application, perhaps performance testing, tests or any sort of validation you need to do that probably requires a deployed application. And then finally from there, and again, hopefully this is all fully automated, you're going to deploy it out to your production environment, wherever it might be, the cloud, maybe you're still running on bare metal hardware, but whatever is production for you, after it passes the automated checks within continuous delivery, it can move then into production. But ultimately, this is like an area that all organizations should hopefully be striving towards, because this kind of, not only is it much faster because it's all automated, but it's much more consistent and reliable, and you can also audit it, which a lot of these things you can't really do with manual. If someone says, oh yeah, like I made that change, or yeah, I tested that, and they might honestly think they did, and they might be truly honestly hook them to lie detector and, says they pass, but they may have just done something wrong. They may have tested in the wrong environment, put in the wrong values. They thought they did some sort of task when they actually didn't. So automation removes a lot of those concerns. And continuous delivery, or Tekton, is just one more option, along with many other options like Jenkins, GitHub Actions, on how to implement continuous delivery. So there's a bunch of different types and resources within Tekton, just kind of like there is within Kubernetes. So there are task, pipeline, pipeline run, event listener, trigger binding, and trigger template. There's many more different types of resources, but these are the ones we're going to be focusing on in this presentation, and they kind of really make up the core of building out like at least a basic Tekton pipeline or Tekton experience, I guess you could say. So I mentioned earlier how Tekton is in beta, and then there's other sub-projects that are maybe in alpha. So task, pipeline, and pipeline run, these are all Tekton types within the core of the Tekton project. And so as I said, this is in beta. So when I kind of reference these, some of the code for these kinds of Tekton resources later on in this presentation, it should match really closely when eventually Tekton goes to general availability. But there could of course be some things added, but what I showed, like there shouldn't be any changes in names or kind of meanings for things. They should stay pretty stable because it is in beta, and I think they are getting pretty close to going GA. Now there's also a bunch of sub-projects. One of the sub-projects is Tekton triggers, as I show here on the screen, and that includes event listener, trigger binding, and trigger template. And as I mentioned, this is an alpha, or at least it was an alpha kind of when I initially started putting this presentation together. So there is more of a possibility that some of what I'm showing here could change in the future. So at least keep that in mind. Broadly, the concepts should remain the same, but maybe just like a field changes or they kind of change up some of the structure of it. I've definitely noticed that when I was researching Tekton, some of the stuff where I was looking at maybe some alpha versions of like Tekton core items in beta, some of the things changed and that caused me some issues as well. So that's probably one of the problems, is because this stuff is in alpha and beta, there are articles and tutorials out there where they're just out of date now because they were made 6 months ago or a year ago when things were just actually different. And I'll actually touch on that also a little bit later on, a couple of things to look out for. So task. This is the most basic unit of work within Tekton, and it executes a series of steps towards some sort of specific goal. So what does that kind of mean? Well, here is what one task, very simple task, looks like. And you can see at the very top the API version as is standard in Kubernetes, and it's using tekton.dev and v1 beta because, as I mentioned, task is part of Tekton core. And here we are using a workspace, and it's a directory where we can retrieve and store work products throughout the pipeline, the execution of the pipeline in Tekton. Now, if I want to reference a workspace or this directory, you can see how where I define it under workspaces and then the name of its source, that's the kind of pathing that you would need to use if you want to reference it. So I have a workspace source. So as I have like another workspace directory, say presentations, I could reference that workspace by going workspace/presentation within the step of a Tekton task. You can also provide parameters within Tekton, which of course makes sense because a lot of times there's going to be dynamic features you're going to need to pass into to actually execute the whatever kind of work you're having to be done. Of course, you can also provide default values. So here I have like a Maven goal, and I'm passing in a package that's going to be generally what I want to have happen within this build task. Also, the parameter types, by default, it's string, but also here with the Maven goal, you can also do an array type. So if you don't define the type, it's going to assume it to be string. But if you want to use an array, that is also an option. But you also have to define an array. It's not going to automatically detect it as an array, even if you kind of use an array-like notation. Also, kind of like with workspaces, we see we have the Params Maven goals. And you can see I'm referencing in the work directory of params.path to context. So if I was going to do, if I was going to do Maven goals in there for some reason, which wouldn't make sense, I would do params.maven goal and where that second arrow is pointing to. A Tekton task can have as many steps as you want it to have. I mean, I suppose there could be some like int overflow level, but hopefully not defining that many tasks. However, or that many steps. However, the number of steps are how the steps are physically defined within the file are the order in which they would be executed. So pretty obvious, but I wanted to point this out because we'll talk about it a little bit later where we need to find tasks within a pipeline. That's not the order that they would be executed in. It actually depends upon how you define a run after, otherwise they would run in parallel. So there is a difference in that kind of behavior that makes sense, but isn't necessarily eminently intuitive, where steps, they execute in the order you define them. You don't have to do anything else to do that, and you can't actually have them execute in any other order than the order that they're defined. Whereas with task, you do actually have to take time and specifically define the order that they be executed in. So this is something to keep in mind. I know it tripped me up a couple times also. The steps, they're ultimately executing just a container. So, and with that, we can just do whatever a container does. In this case, I'm using a Google image for that it's kind of set up to find Maven to build my Maven project or my Java project, referencing that workspace directory I mentioned earlier. And then ultimately the command I'm going to have to execute, in which case it's typically going to be the Maven package. So pipeline. Pipeline defines a series of tasks towards a specific build or delivery goal. And so here, it's a pretty simple Tekton pipeline. And you can, of course, also pass parameters into tasks, and these can also have default values, pretty similar, or almost exactly similar to what they are like within task. Here, I'm defining a workspace, in this case, Git repo, and then you can see within the workspaces of the first task, I'm referencing that name of Git repo, and then the name of output, because there's an output task within that Git clone, which then will put that result of that Git clone, obviously the clone project, into the workspace of that project. So that's kind of how that's all being wired up. As I'm also, like with steps, you can have any number of tasks you want within a pipeline. Again, could be some sort of overflow limit, but hopefully you're not getting anywhere near that level. And then you would reference the name of the task in a pipeline. And then you will also reference the actual defined task within your Tekton catalog. So kind of like what I was showing the task before with the Maven build, the name of it was Maven build Java artifact from source. So I'm referencing that to reference that task that I had defined earlier. But you would also need to define the run after. So I want this Maven build to run after I actually clone the project. So I have to say run after git clone for this to run after. Otherwise, everything would run in parallel. A few other things, you can have outputs defined, as I kind of briefly touched upon, from both at the task level and at the pipeline level. So also, as I mentioned, some of the changes in the API, avoid resources, that's going to be deprecated and removed. Some order tutorials and articles may have referenced or shown that, but you should avoid it because, like I said, it's going to probably be removed. Lastly, there's also a thing called task run, but that's automatically generated when a pipeline's executed, so you would never really be interacting with it directly, but it is something that's also there. Lastly, with the Tekton core, we're going to look at the pipeline run, and this defines a specific instance of a pipeline execution. If you want to kind of have it in Java terms, a pipeline is like a class, and a pipeline run is a specific instance of a class. And so within the pipeline run, you're going to define maybe the specific values of those parameters, those fields, again, to reference back to class, that you're going to have it run. There's also, you're going to define like a generated name, and at the end of it, it's going to append on some sort of hex value just to make sure it's unique. But the name can be also helpful just to make sure it differentiates it from other projects you might be running. You also have to reference a service account because Tekton is going to be creating resources, creating containers and everything as it's running, because it's going to be running those steps. So it needs a service account to have privileges to be able to do that on the Kubernetes container or Kubernetes cluster. And then you just reference the pipeline you're going to be wanting to execute. So kind of like in a little bit earlier, the pipeline itself, like the name of that was project pipeline, probably not a great name, but just as a reference. And that's the pipeline to be executed. You can, of course, pass in parameters that would override any sort of defaults within that pipeline. And then you would also have it defining any sort of workspaces and a reference to that persistent volume claim for that workspace you're going to use, for storing any sort of work products as it's going through that pipeline execution. So next, we're going to kind of get into how we're going to actually trigger one of these builds. And we're going to be looking at first at the event listener, and this defines an addressable sink for events. They could be both, I think, push events and also HTTP REST calls. So here, an event listener, and this is probably going to be how many people are going to be using the event listeners to listen for a push event on a Git project. And again, it's going to need a service account because it's going to be creating resources. And from there, we're going to, also as I mentioned, this is part of the Tekton triggers project, which is currently in alpha. And so we can kind of see then the V1 alpha, there's a misspelling there, but all the same, it's supposed to be V1 alpha. So there is a possibility some of this might look a little bit different once it actually goes GA or even gets into beta. But the triggers, that defines what's actually going to happen when an event gets pushed to this event listener. Then we have trigger binding for kind of extracting information from the event that's being sent to this event listener. And then we'll also get to the trigger template here in just a moment. But as mentioned, the trigger binding, this just extracts fields from the event to pass then onto the trigger template. So in this example, we have a push event from GitHub, and it's going to have in this JSON message, like it's going to have like event repository get URL. It's going to send a bunch of things, but we're only going to need a couple of things. In this case, the get URL and then the checkout or commit ID that caused this push event. And so we want to extract these fields and then pass it on to the trigger template, which eventually is going to pass on to the pipeline. So when you get to that Tekton or to the git clone task, it's going to know where and how to clone the repository. Trigger template, we need to create a bunch of resources, and the trigger template can be the area to do that. And so we have resource templates of like creating like a pipeline run for setting up what that's supposed to look like to actually then execute the pipeline. A little bit further down, we have like a secret for being created, so we can actually then publish to like a private container repository in this case, and also creating a persistent volume claim for a location for our workspace. In this case, these persistent volume claims can be fairly volatile since you really don't need them after the pipeline has been executed, so you don't need to necessarily be storing it to some sort of expensive, stored a disk location. It can be like your host directory or something like that within Kubernetes. But as an overview, this is kind of what this all looks like. Here on the far left, we have the GitLab, or in this case, I'm showing GitLab, also showing GitHub. This is showing like different ways you can do this, but a GitLab push event, a GitLab trigger binding, and the project template. This then creates a pipeline run, which then goes into the project pipeline, which then does the git clone, building the artifact, sending it to a container repository, updating our deployment information, and then eventually then pushing it out to our cloud location, in this case an IBM cloud. And kind of underlying this all, we have our service account, which provides identity and access to create resources on our Kubernetes container. And then kind of what this flow looks like from the actual triggering of this pipeline from your Git repository. It's going to send out a post. It could have headers values, and of course it's going to have a body that has the information that you need to maybe pull out of it. And so within your trigger binding, you can reference these different fields using, the standard kind of JSON notation to extract them out and then pass them on to the trigger template to provide whatever values you might need from it to then build later on in the project, like cloning it or whatever you kind of need to have done. In this case, I'm showing a Git event, but of course it can be any kind of event that could happen. If there's some sort of major error going on in production, maybe that sends off an event that then also kicks off a Tekton pipeline that maybe does something that has nothing to do with deploying. It could be about, process mitigation or kind of collecting logs and stuff like that. So that's kind of some of the extendability you can do of it. But this is how I imagine most organizations, most developers will be interacting with Tekton. Git coming in, just kick off a build. So I did kind of talk about, so there's the reusability of Tekton, but reusability often comes at the expense of adding a lot of layers of abstraction, and we can kind of see it here. So I'm referencing like a deployment file for obviously how this application will be deployed out on my Kubernetes file. And those little red boxes, those show all the areas that this value is being referenced. And it's actually 6 different areas before it finally actually gets into the area where it's used to update it to the deployment file. So it helps with the usability, but it does add a lot of layers of abstraction. It can be a little bit confusing to kind of look at. But here at first, initially within the trigger template, I'm referencing this passive deployment file. Then within the pipeline run, I'm referencing again to pass it into the pipeline. Within the pipeline, I had to define the passive deployment file as well. Within the task, I also have to define it within the pipeline, saying like, hey, for this task, I'm going to be using this passive deployment file. Finally, within the task definition itself, I also define the passive deployment file. And then finally, within the step of the task, I finally actually, put that value to use. So we get reusability out of it, but it does create a lot of layers of abstraction, a bit of confusion. It takes a bit to kind of understand all this stuff, and certainly it's just kind of confusing when initially I was kind of first working with Tekton, having to kind of deal with all these layers of abstraction, and then maybe some of it also, some of these projects or some of the tutorials maybe kind of use confusing naming to make it not always clear sometimes the relationship between these values. So with that, I'm going to leave a little bit of extra time for some Q&A. If you have any questions, definitely put it into the chat. I'll be around until the end scheduled time, which I think is about 45 minutes. So leave any questions you have, and I'll be more than happy to answer them. And if you have a lot of questions, don't feel alone. It took me a lot of time to kind of get to this level with Tekton, and I still have a long ways to go to fully understand it. So also, if you think of questions later, you can also DM me at Billy Korando. And also, if you want to email me, also, sorry, it's not on here, but also email me at wkorando@gmail.com. Thank you very much for coming to my presentation, and hope you also have a great rest of your Devnexus.